Hello and welcome to Golfing Idiots. Today we're going to talk about how to prep a shaft for installation. A couple of assumptions before we get started. One, we're going to prep the tip of a graphite shaft in this example. And now the only difference really between prepping a steel shaft and a graphite shaft really gets down to the difference of the pressure that you can put regarding the sandpaper when you're cleaning the tip. But we'll talk about that as we prep the shaft. So we've already removed the head from this particular shaft. Just going to place that over here, get it out of the way. And you'll notice if you look at the shaft, you're going to see the residue from the epoxy that is remaining on the shaft. And we need to remove all of this, clean this up so that it's ready for new epoxy and to be reinstalled in the head when we're complete. So the next step, we're going to place the shaft in a vise so it's secured. We're going to work on getting off all this epoxy. Now I typically use 180 grit sandpaper or 120. It's a little bit this would be medium, this would be fine. And this ensures that we don't start to dig too far into the removal. We just want to remove the epoxy and then make sure that the shaft end is roughed up so that it's ready to accept epoxy again on the next installation. So simply take your sandpaper and without going any further than where it's been roughed up before and just where your epoxy's at, go ahead and just gently remove back and forth on the shaft and remove all that epoxy. And you'll see it start to come off. Sometimes it's a little bit harder than others. You may have to take a remover to pop some of that off. It's easy if you put a little heat on it, and that will help to pull off some of the bigger pieces rather than having to dig all the way through it. But you're simply just going to start working on getting rid of that epoxy on there so the shaft is ready to go. And as you do this, you'll turn the shaft around and continue removing that epoxy. Nice light pressure. You don't want it to be too heavy because you do not want to get down into the shaft. You just want it clean, old epoxy gone, and then the very outside edge roughed up so that it receives that epoxy. Epoxy holds much better. And now you can see what the shaft should look like after you've gotten the epoxy off. It should be nice and clean, roughed up, ready to go. Now a couple of things to note. If you have a steel shaft, it's very easy. You're going to do the same procedure, but you don't have to risk so much as far as your pressure that you can put with your sandpaper as you're taking out the epoxy, because you're really not going to hurt that steel shaft. Then once you've got all the epoxy off, you again want it roughed up, essentially not shiny like it is here. And if you've got a new shaft, it's going to come completely shiny all the way down to the tip end of the shaft. And so what you're going to do is measure how far that head goes up as far as the hosel, along with the ferrule. And at that point down, you'll rough that up just like this as far as on the tip. So it's ready to receive the epoxy. The epoxy does not hold as well on these slick surfaces, and that's why you rough up the tip of the shaft in order for the epoxy to have a solid grip and bond between the shaft and the club head. Now, a couple of things. I noticed when I took apart this particular shaft, whoever did the install on this aftermarket shaft actually used entirely too much epoxy. So things you want to check for, make sure that you clean the tip end out of the shaft, okay? This had epoxy filled all the way in it, probably up almost to the very edge of the ferrule. And that can cause a problem if you use too much epoxy as far as in your installation. It does not take a ton of epoxy in order to get a solid bond between the golf shaft and the club head, okay? I've got some videos that talk about that amount. But you want enough, but you do not want too much. And the reason you don't want too much epoxy is because it will back up into the shaft and it can potentially create a break point between the shaft and the club head as far as that will make it where it could potentially snap, and that's something that you definitely don't want. So keep in mind exactly how much epoxy you're using. You only need enough. You don't just want to completely sop this thing up with epoxy. So I hope that helps. If you got any questions, leave them below. I did this video in response to a question regarding how to prep a shaft, so I hope this helps. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.